To understand human sexuality or any other subject in science, we must rely on theories and research that's been conducted already. To understand what a theory is, we explain how in the past individuals have kind of paved the way for us by putting to the test some ideas that they had. And through repeated testing, through hypothesis testing, these theories begin to get support. Kind of like the evolutionary perspective, the evolutionary theory has been supported through evidence and through hypotheses that have been uh, conducted through the scientific study. Now, what a theory is an intellectual structure, basically an assumption, a principle, an idea, so that we can understand sexuality. Please note that this gives meaning and they guide our thoughts about human sexuality. That is to say that thankfully we're no longer operating as individuals who have no idea what this was. It was the case for Alfred Kinsey and many others in the past who did not have any theoretical background. In fact, because there were no theories that they would adhere to, they would be considered atheoretical, that is to say, without any framework. Thankfully, today we explore the fascinating study of human sexuality by adhering to some of these theories. You will see that some of these theories are very easy to comprehend. Some of them, like some people have criticized Freud's, is a bit far-fetched. Nonetheless, it serves a purpose in helping us understand perhaps some deeper meaning as to what it is. The research that is conducted would allow us to answer questions that may be of interest, and those could vary significantly from preferences to frequency to differences that may be apparent among different genders, culture, ethnicity. And so this typically is conducted by various disciplines. We have individuals who have studied this from a sociological perspective, from an anthropological perspective, medical, biological, psychological, and many other disciplines have ventured out. Of course, the debate of nature versus nurture is at the root of a lot of these debates and research. However, rather than viewing these as two separate entities, we view them as two that complement one another. That is to say that they work in tandem to help us understand the complexity of human sexuality. As mentioned in our introductory greetings page, this class will assume some familiarity from your general psych course that is a prerequisite for this course here. And when we look at Freud, Sigmund Freud, we talk about the psychoanalytic theory, also known as a psychodynamic theory. And Freud is considered to be one of the most influential individuals in the field of psychology. Now, he is one of those that is not respected by all. There are various people who disagree completely with his theory and with the thoughts that he brought forth. And nonetheless, he has been influential in good or bad ways to the field of psychology. The reason why we speak of him in human sexuality is because he, as you may remember, came up with the psychosexual development. That is to say that we developed a personality from our upbringing through our parents, and by the time we reached adolescence, pretty much our personality was set. This was basically the byproduct of how well we progressed through these psychosexual stages. And you may remember them. These psychosexual stages basically were grounded in erogenous zones, areas of our body that we basically had to go through. So we had the oral stage, where the focal point of pleasure was our mouth. The anal stage, where the focal point of pleasure was the anus, and that's when we were potty trained, and depending on how parents were either very permissive or kind of strict about it, our personality would be shaped in some way. We then had the phallic stage, and the phallic stage is possibly the most controversial of them all. This is where Freud proposed that women were envious of not having a penis, And we also said that boys unconsciously desired mom sexually. Of course, throughout it, we go on to the latency and eventually to the genital stage. But all throughout his theory, we see that Freud acknowledged sex as the drive that is a very important life force there. And he said that our instincts and drives would motivate our behavior. Freud also said that the two most important drives that were forming our personality were libido, that basically is life or sexual motivation, and he said that that was the most powerful of them all. And then thanatos, which basically is death or aggressiveness motivation. I'd like to make a parenthesis in here and ask you whether you think that these two in any way are associated, the aggression and death and libido. There have been a lot of individuals in recent times who have kind of combined these two. And without getting too crude about this in here, there are men that identify themselves as individuals that would destroy or crush or smash when they refer to sexuality. And when you think about how perhaps sexuality for some individuals is a romantic moment where there is delicacy and connection and intimacy, not many women perhaps would be very aroused or seduced by someone who would want to use words that are so aggressive. Perhaps just some food for thought. Maybe they're not connected at all, but it is interesting to see how these two drives that Freud spoke about have in recent times really risen to as one. Please be sure to check the different stages and understand how id, ego, and superego contribute to the understanding of our personality and how each of them basically are developed at different stages. Just to give you an idea of the id and ego and superego, please note that the id, which is present immediately at birth, is the animalistic, primitive, raw, disorganized part of who we are. And Freud said that we all possess part of the id. However, in some it is a lot more prevalent and dominant than in others. The ego, which is developed at around 2 years of age, is the reality principle. It basically tries to balance, the demands of the id and the superego. And the superego is the complete opposite of the id, basically valuing and restricting the demands of the individual. And that is what some people call the conscience. This is developed later in life. And so when we look at individuals who may be very quick to give in to their desires sexually, Freud would say that they would be guided by their id. Someone who may desire something but is able to put that on hold because they believe that it's not the time. Maybe they say they want to focus on their career and education, and so now is not the time to be venturing out. Even though there would be a desire to pursue it, they would then be able to balance it. And that would be the ego that would be more dominant. And the superego, some have described it as the part of our personality that is like a perfectionist. The superego would possibly even shame an individual for wanting to pursue something in there. So Freud again spoke of the progression of psychosexual stages and also how our identity, our personality is guided by these three different identities. Ideally, a person would progress through these naturally and they would not become stuck. Because if you do not progress through these psychosexual stages, Freud said that you would become fixated. That is to say that you would be stuck in one of these stages and then you would be desiring it time and time again. Consider an individual who may be very demanding with his wife or romantic partner later in life. And he says, I want this, and if she says no, then he would throw a tantrum. You'll say, well, adults don't throw tantrums. Well, if you've ever given someone a silence treatment, that may be a form of tantrum for some. Whereas you get upset because they did not do as you were expecting them. That goes back to the id. The id is very dominant and powerful, and it just demands what it wants whenever it wants it without really any concern about anybody else's well-being. A child who is 3, 4, 5 months old, they do not care that mom has to wake up the following day to go to work, or they do not care that mom may be uncomfortable and not necessarily want to breastfeed. What the child wants is to be satisfied and cared for. And sometimes we see adults that engage in similar fashion. So please consider these different guiding principles of our personality to understand the way we express our sexuality today. Not satisfied with the psychoanalytic perspective, there are various other theories, and of course we have neo-Freudians, and then we have the humanistic perspective, cognitive, but the behavioral is by some considered to be the complete opposite of psychoanalytic. You see, Freud focused on studying the inner self. What about you from your childhood and your upbringing contributes to your behavior today? The behavioral theory says, well, we're not interested in that. We're only interested in your observable behavior, meaning what you're doing now and how that may contribute to your current state of mind and behavior. Two main schools of thought for behaviorist perspective are operant conditioning, where we look at reinforcement and punishment. And you may also remember classical conditioning from your Psych 5 course, where we basically look at the parenting two stimuli. Ivan Pavlov with a dog who wanted to teach it to salivate, not because meat was there, but because of the presence of another stimulus. Some people have actually tried to explain fetishes, like a shoe fetish, with classical conditioning. And that is to say, an individual who becomes sexually aroused when they see a shoe. And classical conditioning does a good job at explaining it, because it basically says that since the shoe may have been paired in the past with maybe an attractive leg and maybe some other form of arousal or body part that would arouse an individual, then by the constant pairing of shoes, which would have been a neutral stimulus, and then a body part that would have naturally aroused someone, you begin to pair the two, and out comes this conditioned response, which would have been sexual arousal. And so we understand that a lot of the things that may arouse us today may have been the byproduct of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is different because this one focuses on voluntary behavior, and that is to say, things that you choose to engage in, unlike classical that focuses on reflexive behaviors, which are things that we do not control. Operant conditioning makes use of reinforcement and punishment. Please be familiar with those. Those are the ones that increase the chances of repeating something, like positive and negative. I don't want you to think of them in terms of good or bad, but more so mathematical. With the positive reinforcement, you add something to the equation. For example, your child brings in three A's in his report card, and you give him $5 for every A that's there. By adding $5 to that, you may be increasing the chances that the child will continue to bring good grades. A negative reinforcement would be when you take away something unpleasant. Think of your medicine cabinet. You had a headache, and then you bought some form of medicine that took that headache away, and because it worked and it took away something unpleasant, it now increased the chances that you will continue buying that medicine. Punishment serves a purpose to decrease chances of repeating behavior, and we also have positive and negative, and there you would find that the positive punishment would be if the child does something bad, then you add something unpleasant, maybe a spanking or yelling or a long lecture, and so that would decrease the chances of the child wanting to do it again. Negative punishment would be like taking something unpleasant away. And that would be like if your teenager violates the curfew, you would then maybe take away their phone, take away their makeup, and that may make them think twice about it next time because it was something of value that was taken away from them. By engaging in this type of a modification of a behavior, we use a lot of models that would try to take care of different sexual issues. A lot of modern sex therapy has actually been developed by behaviorists, and that is in an attempt to make someone perhaps dislike something or like something. We'll be talking more about these in future chapters. It is important for us to understand the cognitive theory when it comes down to sexuality. This is a theory that views our brain as the largest sex organ, and the reason why they view it that is because we believe that you can train your brain to really perceive anything as pleasurable. You can actually learn to be aroused by something that is you think is sexually arousing. For the most part, naturally, nude pictures are arousing for individuals. However, when we look at gender differences, there appear to be some differences. Men seem to be more visual and they are aroused more so by more revealing body parts, whereas females tend to be more aroused by different details that may be leading to the nudity that would be expressed there. The film that I'm not a fan of, but that has broken records in a book, 50 Shades of Grey, has actually been quite popular in our society for the reason that they offer a lot of those details that stimulate the mind in different ways. There are a lot of issues, again, within the film and the book that I'm not necessarily fond of, but nonetheless, when we ask different people of different genders to discuss what an ideal date or romantic night would look like, men focus more so on the act itself and the nudity, whereas females may focus more on the details that may have led to the act itself or the nudity. So please note again that there are individual differences in how we process information, and this can bring about a change into our behavior as we may perceive certain things as more arousing than others. Over the years, there have been several claims as to how sexuality really can be understood. And we've discussed Freud, we've looked at the cognitive perspective, the behavioral. You may have seen in your slides that there are a few others that were very easily understood, such as the biological, evolutionary, sociological, and humanistic claims. But also there is a feminist claim, and that's what's become known as the feminist theory. And they do have some concerns with the way we've been studying sexuality thus far. And their claim is that primarily sexology has been dominated by a particular group of people. And typically it's middle class, white, and heterosexist attitudes. That is to say that we assume that there are only heterosexual couples and not a lot of time or enough maybe funds have been allocated to research anyone else that may not be heterosexual. We also find that a lot of the research we get come from middle class white individuals who may have access to a lot of the institutions where the majority of these studies take place. Sexuality research has also been based primarily on male sexuality. And while some people may dismiss this as perhaps just a claim for equality, we do find that over the years, the medicine that has been making a lot of money and pharmaceutical industries have focused a lot on the male sexuality. That is to say, the benefit of the male. And so we look at Viagra, we look at Cialis and various others, and there is a lot more there. Some people say, well, it's the consumption that's why it's there, but we do find that there is a lot more influence in that. You may go back to chapter 1 now and think of how the Kama Sutra was written by men for their own benefit, and think of a particular industry that may be led also by men for the benefit of men. The social construction of sexuality is also based on power that has historically been held by men, and so there is a particular researcher, Leonore Tiefer, who claims that there may have not been any biological sex drive, really, that our culture influences our sexual desire the most, and that it's not really just something that is innate or we're born with. Of course, there are different schools of thought. Some agree with her, some do not. Nonetheless, we do see that throughout history, women have been perceived and applauded for being more passive and submissive. Any deviation from that could get them a bad rep. Also, sexuality has been used by men, over time to maintain power over women. That's a claim that's been made, and we're seeing it currently. And we're speaking of 2017 and on with the Me Too movement, where Weinstein and various others that have occupied seats of tremendous power have basically exploited women over the years. And also, lack of research on the female orgasm. It continues to be one of the most puzzling physiological responses because whereas for men, we can easily explain that perhaps if we equate an orgasm with ejaculation, then we would say that the ultimate goal of orgasm for men would be to reproduce. However, with women, we do not know that orgasm would help at all for reproduction. In fact, we know for sure that it doesn't. And so, because of that, it is not something that is easily understood. And we'll speak of some extreme ways of making sense of the female orgasm later in this course. We also see the queer theory has also become quite popular in recent times. And this is a term, the term queer, that is not offensive if you use it within context. In fact, the LGBTQ community has embraced the term queer, and that's why it's LGBTQ. Lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender, and then the Q would stand for queer or questioning. Anyone who may not be sure of their preference and the orientation would be perhaps in the Q for questioning. They claim that, again, like the feminist component, that there is a lot of heterosexism going around whenever we do research in sexology. And also, they encourage people to resist homophobia. The idea that this is an illness and that it is something that's contagious and that's dangerous and risky has actually deterred a lot of people from researching this further. They claim that heterosexism is not the norm. Even within heterosexual couples, the combination and the penetration of the vagina by the penis is not the only norm. There are various other ways to express that. And in fact, there are a lot of heterosexual couples who, because of either disabilities or because of preferences, they have chosen to explore and express their sexuality in ways different than what we see most commonly there. And also, they claim that sexual categories are cultural constructions that sometimes limit and restrain. So they advocate for an expansion of what we currently have. Interestingly, per a study in 2010, it was found that although 4.2% of males identified as gay, 14% of 40 to 50-year-olds reported having received oral sex from other men at some point in their lifetime. So it's a 10% increase. Also, 2% of female identified as lesbians. However, 9% of them, ages 24 to 40 years of age, reported to having performed oral sex on another female in the past year. So as we look at homosexuality, we understand that whereas some may identify as homosexual, there are others that may identify as heterosexual, yet they're engaging in acts that would be considered homosexual. Researching human sexuality has not been easy. In the early sex research, we find that a variety of disciplines began to focus on sex, not necessarily with the intent of helping people get more satisfaction out of it, but focusing a lot on abnormal and unhealthy practices. During the Victorian era, we find that research on sexuality was suspended until physicians made it an appropriate topic because they said that it was a medical issue that needed to be addressed. Remember that it was during the time where women were not even allowed to play the flute or the saxophone because it was considered to be ghetto or just not necessarily classy for women to discuss openly their sexuality. So early sex research has its root in Europe, where it's primarily studied, and we find that even to this day in Europe, different parts of Europe is where it is mostly discussed um, with less of a shame or less of a taboo. Eventually, it started earning some legitimacy in the early 20th century, and it moved into the United States in 1920s. However, it moved in also with limited funding for research, as there was a lot of resistance, especially from people that were in positions of government. Sadly, a lot of researchers who were interested in studying sex lost their professional status and were accused of having the disorders that they studied and or motivated by lust or greed or fame. Oftentimes, this is what a lot of psychologists go through. They are accused of being insane, even though it's not a psychological term, it is a legal term. They're accused of being the ones that are not stable, and they try to take away reduce their credibility. Americans, again, for the most part, have viewed sex research as a potential threat to social stability. And so only when it's claims, when there are signs that it's going to affect us as a nation, then have we acted to fund research. And we'll see how Alfred Kinsey, one of the revolutionary researchers of human sexuality, uh, faced some very severe possible consequences of having his career ended because of his implementation of adult sexual behavior research in the United States. This guy in here, Alfred Kinsey, taught in Indiana University, and he is considered to be the most influential modern sexuality researcher today here in America. He was atheoretical, which means that he did not have a theory. Some people say that if he had theories to work off of, he would have been able to accomplish so much more because they would have guided him to things. But because there were no theories around, he was operating kind of blindly, if you will. He was venturing onto different things, and this gave way to the movement of sexuality here in the United States. The way he conducted his study was with him and three other colleagues, basically interviewed over 18,000 people to obtain sexual life histories. A lot of people say, well, why didn't you hire more colleagues so that you could study even more people or reduce the workload? But he said that it was very difficult to find colleagues who would be able to connect with people because connecting with people to discuss such private matters was not an easy task. In 1947, he established the Institute for Sex Research, and he found that there were a lot of activities that were performed by the ordinary citizens that were considered unacceptable. For example, masturbation, oral sex, and even homosexuality, which were frowned upon tremendously. They were actually practiced by these people that he interviewed in high levels. His work was controversial because, again, it was revolutionary. Nobody had ever done this before. And in fact, a Rockefeller Institute, who basically donated money to Indiana University, they threatened to withdraw their funds if Alfred Kinsey were to be allowed to continue researching this stuff. They thought that it was obscene and that it should have no place at an academic institution. A few years later, we also have in 1954 Masters and Johnson starting their work, which was also research in sexuality, but slightly different. See, Virginia Johnson is a psychology researcher, whereas William Masters is a gynecologist, and they were the first to bring to sexuality into a laboratory setting. This was really interesting and revolutionary because they actually studied the anatomy and physiological responses of intercourse in a laboratory setting. That is to say that they set up a room that they kind of fitted into a bedroom-like thing, and with the use of a lot of medical devices and other technology, they would be able to study how long it would take females perhaps to become aroused after being caressed in a particular fashion, how long would it take men to also achieve the same status, how long would it take for orgasm, how long after orgasm for them to go back down to their baseline. And so this was really calculated. There was a very meticulous process through which they timed everything, and it was all done in a laboratory. It was very interesting, and through their findings in 1966, they actually published and spoke of what we now know as the human sexual response. It was basically what we now know as the four-stage model of excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And they discovered that there were differences in gender. We'll be discussing this a little bit more in depth later. In 1970, they also spoke of human sexual inadequacy, and that's where they explored sexual dysfunctions. And notice that even though they're revolutionary in their field of sexuality, they still maintain their focus on what is abnormal and not necessarily on how to help others improve their sexual connection and satisfaction. For the most part, because of Virginia Johnson's training as a researcher and a psychologist, excuse me, they began to focus not only on physiological aspects but also psychological thereafter. Please note that their work is composed of 700 heterosexual male and female participants, and this was from 1966, and there was a lot of criticism for it because of how they, again, maintained this heterosexual and heterosexist view. In 1970, Masters and Johnson made the claim that all female orgasms resulted from direct or indirect clitoral stimulation. That is to say that you cannot reach orgasm unless you stimulated that. To this day, we know that the majority of women are not able to reach orgasm with mere penetration, that in fact stimulation of the clitoris facilitates for the orgasm to be reached. Nonetheless, we do find that there are women and there are classes that are in our town and in various parts of the country where they teach you breathing techniques, and by pelvic movement without any type of stimulation of the clitoris, direct or indirect, women have been able to have reported reaching orgasm, and they are no different than orgasms that would have been achieved through direct clitoral stimulation. So this claim has been made, and well, some people believe this, others have proven for this to not be true. As already stated before, the U.S. government throughout history has only acted and by funding a lot of research that deals with sexuality when there have been some type of social crises. For example, in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services called for research of sexual attitudes and practices of American adults as a result of the AIDS outbreak in 1987. However, they do not have not historically funded or called for any research for anything that's not problem driven. So, because the government has been very conservative in their response to funding these studies, a lot of private organizations have funded some of the largest studies that we know thus far. And so we'll be looking at a few of these in here. The NHSLS 1994 basically had almost 3,500 participants in their study, and this was all in the United States, and it was on sexual behavior and attitudes. This particular study was originally funded by the government, and they expected 20,000 participants, but in 1991 there was legislation that eliminated most of the budget for sexuality studies, and as a result of that they had to settle for 3,432 participants. Not a bad sample size, but it would have been a lot more insightful to have been able to study 20,000 participants. National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior, NSSHB, in 2010, also one of the largest ones in here, and they surveyed almost 6,000 adolescents and adults ranging from ages 14 to 94. This was actually done because the internet was already available and readily available. Online polling was actually used so that individuals could respond adequately and also to ensure some privacy. We do find that individuals who take these surveys from the comfort of their home may be more likely to feel comfortable that they're not being looked at by somebody else. Nonetheless, because there are IP addresses where we can pinpoint with very impressive precision where you may be taking the test from or the device, who it belongs to, it also begins to have some issues with the confidentiality and the privacy. Uh, this particular study basically demonstrated things and discovered things such as blacks and Hispanic using condoms more regularly. 80% of teens ages 14 to 17 reported using condoms. That sounds impressive. We'll talk about the flaw within this claim here later. And also 30% of females and 5% of males reported pain during sexual intercourse. This was partly funded by Trojan condoms, and that is again the study in 2010. And the last of the study that we look at here is the NCHA, National College Health Assessment, and this began in 2000, and this is the one with the largest data on health of college students. They look at sexuality, they look at alcohol and tobacco use, nutrition, and mental health. Some of the findings that they came up with from the study were that 6% of males and 3% of females reported having anal sex in the past 30 days from the time this was assessed. 13% reported having made use of emergency contraception within the last year, and a few other discoveries that were brought forth by these privately funded large-scale studies. As much resistance as there has been to fund these sexuality studies, we find that the government has, in the past, funded some of these. But I want you to pay attention to the titles of these studies. Notice how uncomfortable individuals have been in the past to make use of the word sex or sexuality. Notice one of the largest funded large-scale studies that took place in 1973. That's what they call the NSFG, National Survey of Family Growth. That again goes to show how big of a taboo this is for some individuals. And please continue to keep this in your mind that these are all health focused, and they contained limited amount of sexuality questions because they did not want to make use of money, taxpayer money, to understand this better. Please note that NSFG added males in 2002 because it was originally designed for married women. Please note that they were very strict about this whole thing of being married. So that is to say that if a woman went in and she said, well, listen, I'm living with someone, or I'm just having sex with my boyfriend, they would have not allowed her to be part of the study. It was exclusively for married women because that's how it should have been. So again, 2002, they added males to it. It continues. In 2006, 2008, data collection sample was almost at 13,500, male and female, ages ranging from 15 to 44 years of age. The other one is called Youth and Risk Behavior Survey. That's again, look at the name. They cannot bring themselves to use the word sex or sexuality. This began in 1991, conducted every 2 years. And in 2009, more than 16,000 U.S. high school students were surveyed. Things, again, that were discovered in there, 6% had engaged in sexual intercourse before the age of 13. So it goes on to say that there are important things that need to be addressed. Well, why should we be interested in the sexuality of a teenager? Well, teen pregnancy and the ramifications that that brings to the individual and their offspring. And typically it's a multi-generational issue because then their offspring have an increased chance of also getting pregnant at earlier ages. And it continues. So we have that there. We also have the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, that's ADD, and this is considered to be the most comprehensive longitudinal study of adolescents. This basically has been carried out from ages grades 7 through 12, and they follow them into adulthood. So it started in 94, and they've assessed them every so often. The last of the government studies that we've looked at, and again, keep in mind these are large-scale studies. There have been a few others that are at the state level or local level, but it comes down to states. And there are some states that are a lot more conservative about their approach. There are some others that are more progressive. And so the funding at the state level and at the local level have varied, but they don't necessarily reach the large scale that we would hope for to make this more valid. NSAM, which is the National Survey of Adolescent Males, another longitudinal study, and this is a nationally representative group of about 6,500 adolescent males. They are all heterosexual, as we know, and they basically focus on the activities that they engage beyond intercourse. And so they've looked at mutual masturbation, which is basically when an individual would be having sex with a partner, but instead of maybe penetrating or engaging in intercourse, they would masturbate one another. Oral, anal sex, and various other forms of expressing that. Again, the interest behind the government in this particular case was not to discover whether children, adolescents, young adults were engaging in different forms of sex, but because they were concerned about sexually transmitted infections and teen pregnancy. Conducting research with humans always has to be one that we are meticulous and careful with. We must ensure that individuals are given privacy and that we don't force them to participate in something that they may not be interested. So the ethical guidelines have to be adhered to. We have to protect them from physical and mental harm, and we have to inform them prior to them participating what the study will be about. We also have to ensure confidentiality, that is to say, we do not get them to identify themselves in any way, shape, or form. This is not only the right thing to do, but it also increases the chances that our participants will be honest and truthful with their responses. You can imagine that any study could perhaps be one where individuals may want to lie, either because they don't want to admit to that, even if we ensure confidentiality, or because they want to mess with our data. But if I were to ask people, what do you prefer, pancakes or waffles, this is something that you may be a lot more comfortable admitting publicly. However, if we ask more personal details, such as sexuality, this is something that it really kind of starts tying into the way we do research and possibly even taking away from the validity of our study. So we must be sure that we address these issues and problems whenever we conduct sex research. Volunteer bias basically is when there are differences between volunteers and non-volunteers of sex research. And so we may not be able to have good generalizability if there are volunteers that may have a particular interest. For example, think back to Masters and Johnson. These individuals surveyed over 700 people, heterosexual people, that volunteered to be observed while they engaged in sexual intercourse. And so through those participants, Masters and Johnson were able to publish that it took X amount of time for orgasm to be reached and how long it took thereafter for them to go back to baseline. And we find that although those findings and those numbers may be somewhat representative of the population, we find that the majority of people would not be comfortable with being watched by someone while having sex. And so this begins to call into question whether there is a volunteer bias, meaning that those that volunteered are not representative of the majority of people. Another thing is sampling problems, where there may be a sample of convenience, again, focusing primarily on college students, those of higher socioeconomic status. And sometimes we say, well, what about those that don't go to school? What about those that may not be part of these studies? Does that mean that their sexuality is not being understood and researched as well? Also, we want to make sure that there is reliability among this in here. The attitudes, the comfort of sexual behavior has changed over time. If you ask individuals in the 1940s what they thought about certain behaviors today, they would tell you that things have changed. I know when I speak with Grandma, she is shocked as to how the younger generation today and how we deal with dating. She was telling one of my cousins who brought a guy that she was talking to over to the house, and Grandma saw them holding hands, and the guy was there, so Grandma assumed that it was her boyfriend. So when Grandma said, what's your boyfriend's name, and talking to him, my cousin said, oh, he's not my boyfriend. And then Grandma looked shocked. She said, well, she said after they had left, back in the day, she said, if he was not my boyfriend, I would not hold his hand. I would not kiss. Only if he's my boyfriend would I then do that. Now, we don't know how truthful that is. Maybe she did kiss. She's just not telling. But in any case, she is demonstrating how back in the day things were done differently. Today, there are various changes as to how we express our affection toward others, and the comfort with sexual behavior has definitely changed from previous generations to what we have today. Understanding sexuality is very complex. We can understand the sexuality of a particular state, and here California, for example, and that would not or may not be the same as the sexuality in another state within the same country. Now imagine sexuality across different cultures and around the world. There are differences because of living arrangements, because of cultural differences, because of religious differences. So when we look at human sexual behaviors, we know that there are a lot of large cultural studies, and there's a lot of commonalities, but there's also some pivotal differences. Some of the biggest studies that have been conducted globally have actually been done by private organizations, and so we find that, for example, the Pfizer's global study of sexual attitudes and behaviors was one of the first global examinations. They took into account 28 countries, and they assessed the behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, and they got an impressive sample size of 26,000 people. Durex, another company, also 2007, conducted a study of attitudes and behaviors of 41 countries, so they went a little bit further, but also they had a similar sample size. They took into account whether these countries were collectivist or individualistic cultures. That is to say, individualistic like us in the United States, or collectivist like some parts in Asia, and also Latin American countries where they view the family and the social setting as more important than the individual preferences of individuals. Please note that these studies, these global studies, are very expensive. And you can imagine, again, the work, the task force that has to be sent out to different countries. But there have been some interesting findings that to this day we are still puzzled by. We do find that female orgasmic ability varies greatly by culture. In some parts of the world, they do not necessarily emphasize female orgasm. In fact, sadly, there are some women that go through what we call clitorectomy, where young girls basically have the external part of the clitoris removed because they say that there's no point in women having that. And you can imagine how difficult it and how outdated these countries must be, but they still exist. We also find that heterosexual couples, males typically initiate foreplay, and also that sex is most common at night before falling asleep. So we have some similarities in some parts of the world. And also a very interesting one, the one that again puzzles us, is that masturbation is rare in pre-literate cultures. Now, a pre-literate culture are those who do not have a written language. So if there's a dialect and there's just no written language in there for some reason that we do not fully understand, their masturbation is not as common. So here is the finding of a study, Durex Global Study. And this study basically asked the frequency of having sex to these individuals. So this reveals the percentage of individuals who reported having sex, and that is per week. Notice here where we as a nation are. You may be going down the line right here. I was like, no, United States. Greece at the very top. Perhaps you're not too surprised. After you've read chapter 1, you know that they were considered to be among the most permissive in various ways of expressing their sexuality. Then you have Brazil go down, all the way down. The United States is significantly lower. Look, all the way down, almost close to how the Japanese reported having sex weekly, and they're considered to be among some of the most conservative when it comes to this in here. So this was a study that again was conducted in 2007. Maybe a few things have changed since, but we haven't had another study because again it's very expensive. But it gives us an idea of how we say. And now we could say, well, these were individuals that reported having sex weekly, but there could have been some type of issue with the way they reported it, because maybe they were people who engage in more common behaviors more frequently, excuse me, but they did not want to admit it, and that's an issue that we run into research, that individuals engage in what's known as social desirability. Let's say that a person really engages 10 times a week, but they feel that that is a bit excessive and they don't want to stand out more, so they may then lie and say they only do it 5 times a week. And so as a result of that, it throws off our numbers because in actuality, they're not engaging in it 5 times a week. So please keep these issues in mind as we go through studying sexuality. And so wrap up our chapter notes in here, the review. Please note that sex research in the future is expected to be beyond problem-driven research. No more focusing only on sexuality because we are broken or in need of that. We need solid sexuality research. There are a lot of unexplored and underexplored topics within this field, and they include emotional and relational aspects of sexuality. Oftentimes, whenever we address sexual stuff, we think again of a perversion and individuals that are filled with lust and greed and just want to fulfill their own desires. But there is a lot of benefits. There are a lot of benefits to researching this further. Reliance also on private companies, pharmaceutical companies, can be problematic because it creates a bias. So there are individuals who advocate strongly for the government to be involved, because when you allow a private company to have control of what is being discovered, then they could really shoot up the price of a product. You may remember the controversy of the EpiPen not that long ago, where the price of it skyrocketed and there was really no justification for it. Well, that's one of the problems that we can face when we give a lot of the private companies the full green light, and we do not, as a government, subsidize or at least cover part of this in here. And also, we need to continue to rely on one another as disciplines so that we can understand sexuality better. It is a complex topic that requires that we put our heads together and think about how it affects us socially, psychologically, and view maybe from anthropological views and research. Even theologians would have been able to contribute to how human sexuality is best achieved and for what purposes and how we can get the best form of satisfaction.